Hi everyone, I'm Harv, Ian Harvey, founder of Collective Intelligence, and this is Stuff That Matters Now. Kia ora everybody, welcome back. It's the beginning of 2022 and we've put 2021 behind us, which is nice to put that to bed and focus on a new year. And I couldn't think of anybody better to do that with than Rosalie Nelson. Kia ora, Rosalie.
Kia ora.
The CEO of the Edmund Hillary Fellowship, and thank you so much for your time, Rosalie. And I'm going to pass over to you to introduce yourself first before we dig into today's podcast.
Tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Ko mangatapu te maunga, e rū nei tāku ngako, ko maitai te awa, e mahaya nei aku maharahara. No whakatū aho. Ko Rosalie Nelson, tōku ingoa, ko te Chief Executive Edmund Hillary Fellowship. No reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Thank you, Harv. Can I say, I feel really privileged to have the opportunity to sit here with you. And I know that you will ask some very penetrating questions that I probably won't have answers to, but I'm looking forward to that challenge.
Great putting me on a pedestal before we start, Rosalie. Anyway, look, thank you so much. And was on our agenda last year, but you disappeared into lockdown in Auckland for a wee while. Mm-hmm. Yeah. What was that like?
Actually, interesting and recalibrating, I think. I had taken on this new role on the 8th of March, and I'd been spending a week in Auckland and a week in Wellington, and so it was hectic, and there was so much doing, and to suddenly find myself boxed into a 90 square metre apartment, unable to do that face-to-face contact initially, I found, I think, really, really difficult. Particularly engaging with government, because government does tend to like to do things face-to-face. So on that front, you know, it did take me probably sort of 4 to 6 weeks, but there were some wonderful things about it as well. And the recalibration was actually coming back to, actually things are more simple. You don't need to have back-to-back meetings. Having some time to be able to work on things and to think. I learned how to read again. Which was interesting, to read in a way that you lost yourself and just read a whole book. I haven't read like that since I was a child. So I have devoured books. I do have to note, most of them were not self-help. They were not about leadership. They were entirely...
Escapism.
Escapism is a good way to describe it. But it was kind of wonderful to find that I could actually do that again. And so now I'm approaching 2022 and thinking, actually, there's some great lessons that I don't want to lose, bringing into this year.
Isn't it interesting that, you know, you talk about reading escapist type books as almost an apology, but they are so phenomenally good for us, for the imagination and letting all that stuff happen, you know? Yeah. Now, Rosalie's given me 3 wonderful topics today, and I am resisting the urge to dive straight into that because I do this at the beginning and I was just like, I just want to talk about those, but we won't. I'll be nice and I will ask about where you've come from. I'm just trying to distract myself from these topics. So, Rosalie, you're the CEO of the Edmund Hillary Fellowship. How do you get to this position? What sort of a journey do you have, and why did you take this role on? So I'll ask that one later. But here you go, here's the question. What makes you suitable for this job?
Oh, it's a question that I have frequently asked myself. There is no linear path that has brought me to this place, but in many ways it's the portfolio career and the nature and breadth of experience that I've had that, somewhat to my own surprise, I'm finding is very suitable. so I began my life, my home life was actually born and bred in Nelson. Very much working class family. You know, father was a retreader. That was a career and a profession in those days.
Yep.
He had his own business in Nelson. My mother, well, she had 6 children, and in those days that pretty much took up all of your life and your time. And
I think in these days it still does. 6 children takes up.
Yes. So the mindset in those days was very much, you know, you needed to have a trade. A trade would serve you for life. None of my family had gone to university. They'd gone into nursing and teaching professions, but had never followed that path. So my journey, we moved to Auckland, and I went into journalism, which I'd wanted to do from the age of 5. But that was mainly because someone came to the school, wore a really cool leather jacket. So I thought that if I became a journalist, I could wear the coolest of leather jackets, which, needless to say, I did, ultimately. And so I had this, I did a postgraduate course in journalism without doing the pre-graduate degree. So I don't have a degree. But I did jump through a whole lot of hoops of having things published. Working for the New Zealand Herald, and I had to have 12 pieces published and get certain marks and all of that. So I did the journalism course, and then sort of was launched onto this amazing career, 5 or 6 jobs in 5 or 6 years, but always headhunted to a new job. So that spanned from working for the Evening Post, working for the National Business Review as a columnist, and when it was going daily, this was back at the share market crash days, working up in Parliament for Roger Douglas as a press secretary in the last 9 months of him being there, which was utter and complete chaos that I didn't have the maturity to understand, but fascinating in retrospect. Working for Radio New Zealand with Morning Report, the Fair Go program for 5 years, and then heading off to London. And it was over in London that I went on I'd always been doing business and economics, and it was in London that I moved into technology, kicking and screaming, I have to say.
What year is that?
So I went to London in 1995.
So technology is still pretty new.
Yeah.
Just going back to your career in journalism, why were you headhunted? What were you good at?
I think the skills that have sat underneath it throughout has been the curiosity and the loving to hear from many different people, many different lens and perspective, but then the ability to be able to look at that in a system sense and to be able to synthesize that into something that made sense. And in journalism, that was in a story sense, and I loved the communication that came from taking stories or complex ideas, because business and economics is always more complex than just a straight, sort of news story, he said, she said. So that really became my passion. And when I went to London and I was working for European Business News, which was the television arm of the Wall Street Journal, and it was on a program called Future File. And it was so much fun because it was about the future of technology and being able to explore what was beyond what we could see today. And so much of actually what we talked about we've seen come to bear, and there was so much that we completely missed, which is what's fascinating, and the unintended consequences of what we were seeing, because those were the days when we had the internet just emerging.
Mm-hmm.
It was not out there as mainstream. So you had the internet, you had mobility, and we had the first sort of mobile phones, but they were starting to talk about smartphones. They were talking about internet anywhere, anytime as this incredibly exciting concept. Would the internet ever become a business tool? Right. Those were the sorts of conversations that you were having at that stage. So, so for me there was that curiosity to listen and hear the stories and to be able to synthesize it back and communicate it. And that really took me into my next job, which was as an analyst, which was a completely different path and role. But actually the underlying criteria for it was exactly the same. The skills were needed.
So what I'm missing though, so then you say you went on to this IT, and then into the start or analysis stuff. But why?
So I was having a wonderful time in London.
Yep.
But while I was there, so, best of times and worst of times, I had made many friends. My marriage broke up.
Right.
And so there was...
You've been married how long?
We'd been together 10 years.
Right.
We'd been married probably about 2.
Yep.
So we broke up when I was in London. And I went into another relationship. And then, completely unexpectedly, found myself pregnant sort of 9 months into that relationship. And so then 24 weeks in, found myself facing the prospect of being a single parent. So on the one hand, I had this job where I was travelling. I'd jump on a plane at a moment's notice. I'd be going off and interviewing CEOs. I was presenting with European Business News, which then became CNBC Europe. So I had that amazing lifestyle. Didn't work with a newborn child.
So when you're saying presenting, you're on air?
On air, yes.
Right.
Yeah, presenting for the program.
So we've skipped that, Rosalie. How do you go from being a journo to being on air?
Look, to me, I was always a journalist. The presenting was just a part of the communication. So when I was working for Radio New Zealand, I was, on air talking about business news. Fair Go, I was part of the team, working with Philip Alpers and Kerry Woodham and, the whole Kevin Mill.
Yep.
So it was on air.
Right, so
with
you were used to the camera.
Very used to the camera
Got
by
it.
that stage.
Got
Yep.
it.
And then sort of went to London, was a presenter for Future File as well as journalist. I never wanted to lose that. And then had opportunities to sort of host breakfast programs.
So you're cruising around Europe and you've got this exciting life.
Yep.
And then you've got a baby.
Yeah.
And then what happens?
Your world changes overnight. It was one of the most terrifying, ultimately rewarding, but most terrifying times in my life. I didn't have security.
You haven't got family over there?
I had no family over there. No, none of my friends had children, and my husband and I had a house in New Zealand. I was 30 at this stage. We had a home in Wellington, but I didn't have any kind of capital to invest in being able to provide what felt to me really important, which was a safe space. So what basically happened for me was my husband was lovely. We sold the house. I had enough. At 9 months pregnancy, I still don't know how this happened, to buy a little flat in London. My mother came over at 72 years, never having left the country before, helped me through the first 2 months. And then I went to nanny share and I tried to juggle. I tried really hard to juggle television and the demands of television. I would get calls at 5 a.m. in the morning saying, "You've got to come in on air because this has happened with the Microsoft antitrust case overnight. We need you to commentate." So I'd go in there with my daughter, hand it to the producer, go on air, and then find my way back to the nanny share, sort of back in Balham, and then try and get back to work again. It was crazy. It was utterly insane. George's first trip overseas was when she was 6 weeks old for the Wall Street Journal CEO Summit, where we had producers, directors, I was presenting, and my mother with this tiny 6-week-old
So now the
baby.
72-year-old is becoming the international jet
She
setter.
loved it. She absolutely loved it. Yes. So there came a point of complete and utter exhaustion where I...
I'm exhausted just listening to it.
It was crazy. It was crazy. And so I began to think about other work. And in my job, we used to talk to a company called Ovum, and Ovum was really interesting because what they used to do, they would forecast technology disruption. So they would forecast new trends and advise what that would mean for industries. And so they were looking for analysts, and they knew me from my work at CNBC, so they invited me in for an interview. And so I started on this whole new journey of actually learning to really analytically dig deep and to analyse disruptive trends with new technology. My areas were around mobility and digital media. The emergence of streaming platforms and those sorts of things. And it was wonderful. It used all the same skills because you were talking to many, many people.
This one I actually understand.
Yeah,
There we
synthesize that.
Yeah.
And then you're communicating, you're presenting at conferences, which is always more scary because you've got your entire audience there in front of you.
Yeah.
So I did that for 7 years, I think, seven or 8 years.
In London, based in London?
In London for the first, I'm just thinking here, it was the first 4.5 years.
Yep.
And my daughter was just getting ready to go to school.
So George is a daughter, there we go.
Yeah, that's my daughter.
Yep.
I'm not telling this in a very linear fashion, am I?
No,
I'm
it's
jumping all over
okay.
the place.
I mean, you've been on TV, but you're shit at this.
Yeah, I'm shit at this.
It happens.
It's talking about me. I can't. How am I supposed to do this? Yes, so my lovely daughter was 4.5, and they offered me a secondment to go to Melbourne and to be the principal director and research director for Asia Pacific. And the main reason that I made that jump, I thought, well, I'm closer to home. But also, secondly, I was finding in London, again, the demands for travel in my role were making it incredibly difficult.
Right.
So in Melbourne, I had the opportunity to have someone live in. I had a place that could be big enough to have someone live in, look after my daughter while I was going and doing these trips to, China, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, Philippines.
And I'm starting to get the picture of why you haven't read a book since you were a kid. Yeah?
Yes. There were a few things that fell by the wayside, and self-care was probably one of those.
Yeah. So what drives this work ethic?
That's an interesting one because it probably leads to one of these issues or these topics.
Shall I bring it in?
Yeah, you can bring that in.
I'll bring it in later. I'm going to ask you that question. So Melbourne, based there.
Yes.
You've got George.
Yep.
And
we're there for 4 years.
Yep.
And at 4 years, I'm offered I'm pretty close to burnout. In fact, I took a 3-month sabbatical.
I'm sorry, Rosalie. Pretty close to burnout. Shit, I'm burnt out just listening to you. Pretty close to burnout. You were most probably in burnout for years.
Yeah.
Yeah, you just kept going.
But then the physical part started to catch up.
So we take notice of that.
Yeah,
That's
finally.
good.
Finally. Yes. So I took a break. I took a 3-month sabbatical. And at the end of that time, I went, actually, maybe it's time for me to come home. Maybe it's time.
How long had you been
8.
away since that?
So it was about 13 years, I guess, in total.
Just that physical burnout. Was there a moment that happened that you just crumbled, or was it like a realization over a period of time?
It was on a trip to Singapore, and we used to do these 5 countries in a week, and your meetings were going from sort of 8 a.m. to dinners that night, and then you get on a plane and you'd arrive in the next city at midnight. And I ran out of adrenaline. I had no adrenaline. And I can remember, because each time, however exhausted I was, I could stand up and I could be presenting or engaging with customers or clients, and the adrenaline would kick in, and it just didn't. And I started getting migraines. And those 2 factors, I just came back and I just went, I've got nothing left to run on now. This is it. And because I'd always had a high resilience, that was a real real shock to the system, and I thought, if I don't do something about this, I'm going to break seriously.
Yep.
And so that was the point that I had to rethink it.
Has there any been side effects of that? Because, I mean, when you talk like that, and the people who know this stuff, is that you would have been burning resources internally in your body for years, right? Any side effects from that, or were you just able to recuperate over time?
Always subject to migraines after that.
Yep.
Yeah. So migraines became very much a part of my life that I had to manage. But apart from that, no, I actually did manage to come back.
Toughy.
Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting, isn't it?
Yeah. Built for stamina.
Did that come from your which side of the family? Both sides?
Possibly my dad.
Mm.
Possibly my dad. My dad was a perfectionist, and he'd had a hard life.
Mm.
Extraordinary life, but hard. So, I think he had a lot of stamina.
Yeah, it's interesting where we pick it up from. So, you're saying, I'm going to come back to New Zealand after the 3-month break, and the country would have changed a bit.
Well, I was coming back. I hadn't lived in Auckland for 20 years. So, and my job didn't exist here.
Mm.
So it was a very strange. I'd lived this global and international and constant travel lifestyle, and suddenly I felt like I was in a cul-de-sac at the bottom of the world, and I was, okay, how do I cope with this? So I initially went into, I got some contract work and ended up working for a communications strategy company. That, oddly enough, took me up to a 9-month secondment up at Sky City, which was very strange for me because it was totally outside of my world. You know, this issue of gambling and dealing with the regulatory and the problem harm around gambling was fascinating and gave me some insights into government, but sort of not my long-term place.
I was going to say, it sounds a bit dull compared to what you've been doing. Sorry.
And that place, I just sort of thought, no, this is not where I want to be. And then I started working for IDC in New Zealand, and IDC was very different to what I've been doing previously.
What's IDC?
So, actually, I can't even remember what it stands for anymore. It's an international business that does have some similarities to Ovum, but it's much more about counting, sort of box counting.
Just like, look at the excitement. Yeah.
But I had the opportunity to take over an effectively sort of pretty moribund practice and to make it into what I wanted it to be. And that was really interesting because it was in the telecommunications sector. I'd been doing so much in broadband, in mobile, in digital media, that this world was I knew that. And it was at the time when we were just beginning to go down this path of structurally separating telecom and bringing broadband into the country and rolling out fibre. So was able to build that into a really sort of successful practice, even though it was quite different from what IDC was doing in the rest of the world. And so stayed there for a while, and then there just came a point of where I needed a change, and so I was invited to actually go into Chorus and work as their head of market strategy, and that took me into a corporate world. That was my first genuinely corporate job. And I learned a lot.
That's interesting because I had thought most of the other things you're talking about is in a corporate sphere.
It's in a corporate sphere, but you're consulting. You're effectively, when you're doing research analysis, you're doing all the analysis and then you build a consulting practice from it. So it's a little bit different from actually being in-house.
Okay. So your first corporate gig and?
For the first time, I understood why there is so much work that consultants do. And some of it's really great work. And they'll be dealing with people at an executive or strategic level, and everyone seems to get it, and then nothing ever happens. And you wonder why nothing ever happens. And when you go into a corporate and you realise that actually so many corporates are structured to be an incredibly beautiful machine that produces what needs to be produced, and change is really bloody hard. And so learning that firsthand was really interesting and very helpful. And I decided I really didn't want to stay or be in the corporate world, so I didn't quite know what I wanted to do then. But then I got the opportunity, was invited to go to Callaghan Innovation as New Zealand's innovation agency and to work there doing strategy, impact and insights, which again, that's a big leap into public sector.
What year was that?
That was 3.5, or actually coming up probably now sort of 4 years ago.
Right. And that's because the thing is that with that, I was thinking about your where you've come from. You brought a huge amount of experience into that space. Yeah.
Well, the time, I guess, with Chorus had taught me so much. It had taught me a fair bit about government and regulatory, and also I got a lot more into data and analytics as well, because that was such a core part of the role. So, but going into Callaghan Innovation was much more about the innovation sector and understanding and looking at the challenges of, working on one side with government, which is bureaucracy. It does have a way of working. Some really amazing people, but has a way of working. And on the other side, an incredibly dynamic, fast-moving, fast-paced group. And being the bridge across that, and having been, as an organisation, we were formed from a patchwork quilt of different parts of other agencies, which had not been fully integrated, different cultures. It was complex and it was challenging.
And all the time you've got the name Callaghan, which is synonymous with this future and all the things that we can be and could be under that Callaghan banner. And because it's such a, well, certainly in my little sphere, it's such a powerful name.
It is a powerful
because
name.
you're such an advocate for what we could be. Yeah. And then 4 years or 3 years into that, and this position with the Edmund Hillary Fellowship came up.
I tried very hard to talk them out of employing me. And what I mean by that is I was always intrigued by, and I knew quite a lot about the Edmund Hillary Fellowship. And so when the opportunity first came up, and I thought I was actually in the process of leaving Callaghan Innovation, I want to take a break. I was tired. And the role came up, and I have said this, so it's okay. And I initially thought, look, this is good practice for me. I'll get my CV together, I'll go and do some interviews, but not sure that this is the right role for me. And so, that continued on. And my concern was actually that I thought that they probably were looking for someone who was a real entrepreneurial driver. And my background had been so much more in sort of strategies and engaging with really wide stakeholder groups and so on. So I probably went in with an entire misconception about what was actually required. So my first discussion with the board was going, look, I think this is a fabulous role for someone. I just don't think I'm the right person for the job. It may have actually worked, because they did seem to spend a lot of time persuading me that actually I could be the right person for the job.
Reverse psychology.
Yeah.
Is it the most unsure you've been about a job coming in through that interview process?
Yes.
And then 12 months on, how are you doing?
Actually, I love it. I'm overwhelmed by it. I'm frequently self-doubting, but loving it. And it is such an unusual thing that has been created here. It is entirely unique. But there is such a joy. So for those that may not be familiar with the Edmund Hillary Fellowship, it is a cohort of 532 global innovators, entrepreneurs, investors, systems designers, social enterprise. That diversity in itself is extraordinary. The difference in mindsets and cultures is extraordinary. Brought together under a visa program that's now ended, so at a complete point of transition. The visa pilot has ended. Half of them haven't been able to come in because of COVID, so there's all the management of that. But it's like, how do we unlock and activate the collective potential of this extraordinary group of people? And that's a really exciting challenge. And the generosity of spirit, the kindness, the support, has made me realise just what an incredible resource this is for the country.
And Rosalie, this concept, so 530 odd fellows across how many countries?
47.
And the intention is that they come to New Zealand on a 3-year visa, the internationals. So some Kiwis, mostly international, they come over. But because of COVID, a lot haven't been able to get here.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. It was basically in 2016, it was a pilot program that wanted to trial a fundamentally different way of trying to attract investors and entrepreneurs. And the program in and of itself was really successful. It attracted extraordinary people, like yourself, Harv, into the fellowship.
I came in the last cohort. They let me squeak in at the end.
Look, it is, yes, there's about 132 sort of Kiwi fellows in there. Then there's 400 global, which is the number of visas. But what was interesting about it was that, yes, there was a visa that gave sort of 3 years of flexibility to be able to come and go. And if impact was being established, then there was a pathway to permanent residency. But unlike previous visa program where it was all just did you fit the box? This was actually founded around the idea of a fellowship, and they went through, any fellow went through very robust, multiple interviews, a panel selection process.
I'm rolling my eyes now.
Yes. So it was not particularly simple, and there was very much a sort of portfolio approach. So there was incredible diversity that came in with it, and there was a real sense, therefore, of not only the power of the fellowship, but also the aligned sense of purpose. Actually, New Zealand has something. There is something in our identity. There is something in our values, our place in the world. The things that we have thought have been so negatively about are actually incredibly empowering and positive. And so many of the fellows that have come in haven't just come for a visa. They actually see something in the identity of New Zealand, something that can be done, even if it is emergent, that would really transform the rest of the world. And that's the part that's exciting.
What do they see?
What they see is, and I think you have to look at it through multiple lenses. One of the lenses is that we are a politically stable country. We're not wildly polarised. Even though we might shift slightly left or right with the government, there is a stability and there is a sense of core values. And it's only been amplified by the way that we've managed COVID.
Yeah.
So there's a sense of, actually, New Zealanders have a sense of fair play. There's a sense of values-based innovation, which I think is really interesting. They see our size and our distance from the rest of the world as being an incredible opportunity. And that really works because we're less subject to the groupthink. And we're less subject to the kind of toxic cultures that other incredibly successful cities or countries have had around innovation. But actually, it's not driven the kind of change or even the positive change that could be done at a systems level. They've looked at us as a country having frameworks around not just economic but social and environmental well-being. And even if we don't quite know what that looks like yet, there is a sense that actually within that we can do profound, not just economic change, but systems change. But the other piece that I also think is incredibly powerful, and this doesn't happen at the time of selection, it happens when fellows are welcomed into the country, is the te ao Māori. experience. And understanding how those principles of kaitiakitanga, the guardianship and the care, not just for people, but for land, flora, and fauna, they see actually that if we embrace those principles, embrace the principles of thinking intergenerationally, we have opportunities, and manaakitanga, that servant leadership of valuing the mana of someone else as higher than our own. Those principles and those values are kind of woven, even if we don't always recognise it, into the fabric of what makes us a country. And there's something incredibly powerful in that if we want to begin to define ways of doing business and thinking about the world in a really fresh way.
Nice.
Do I sound a bit too evangelistic
No,
on this?
no. I was no. The poor are just sitting there. No. It's the opposite. I'm just sitting there going, sounds fabulous.
Sounds really exciting.
It does. And it's just I'm just sitting here basking in that, because it's nice to hear a Kiwi being proud of being Kiwi. We forget, we've got so wrapped up in our world sometimes that we forget just how stable we are. We have a democracy that works. We're one of the few countries in the world our democracy works. I worked with a fabulous woman a few years ago, Mary Beth Robles, and she was a New Yorker, and she would trip home to the States. It was maybe 3-4 years ago. And she'd come back to New Zealand and she'd go, it just cracks me up, people getting upset about stuff in New Zealand. And she said, back home we've got teenagers shooting teenagers, and we've got riots, and we've got people burning buildings, and And she said, oh my God, it's so nice to be back. But we think this stuff is such a big deal. And I suppose it is to us at some stage, but we have so much freedom to get on and do such amazing work.
That's right.
Yeah. So Rosalie, the thing with the fellowship at the moment is that majority of New Zealanders have not heard of it, and the ones that have heard of it still don't quite get it.
Yeah.
And some of the fellows don't quite get it, and the fellowship hasn't been activated fully yet because of the borders and all that sort of stuff. So I mean, you've got a big job on your hands here to try and get this thing, get the wheels turning.
Yes. And also, it's a really peculiar challenge, because what we were set up to be was a visa talent attraction program. So we would, attract, select, welcome, and then we'd move on to the next cohort of attracting and selecting and welcoming fellows. And that's done. So what we're having to do now is retrofit a strategy onto a pre-scaled and immensely diverse group of people. And my core belief is that actually there is enormous power in that diversity. Someone said to me quite early, and I thought it was a beautiful metaphor, was that, were we going to be a garden of butterflies? So were we basically going to create this lovely space that would attract, all these lovely, brightly coloured investors and entrepreneurs who would pollinate wonderfully as they went? Or were we actually trying to create an environment where you had a hive of bees? And the hive being that actually there was a collective, many, many different roles and functions, but there was an alignment and a collective purpose. So partially that's what I really wanted to test. So midway through this year that we went through a big process of co-creation with fellows. And with support from a fabulous advisory group. And, the thing that really came through for me was that core passion. They felt the purpose here was to partner with Aotearoa to find and build solutions to our toughest challenges, with the ambition being not for themselves but for Aotearoa New Zealand to inspire global leadership and solutions for future generations. That wasn't, like the words sound lofty, but actually that ambition absolutely was at the heart of what we heard
And
from
that's
the
not,
fellows.
and that's not butterflies.
No, that's not butterflies. That's not butterflies. So the next step is actually great ambition. How are we going to make that happen? How do we resource ourselves? What's the new business model? What's the organisational design? And the role of EHF as an organisation to actually help to facilitate and make this happen.
So when you were going through that last year, through that process, did it feel overwhelming sometimes when you're going through that process?
Yes, and so I'm trying to think of the best way to describe this. One of the lessons that I have learned, one of the hardest lessons of my life, but also the most valuable, was that art of letting go and being able to walk forward with massive ambiguity on one hand, held in one hand, but with the need for decision making and momentum on the other, and not stumbling over the mystery in the pursuit of a decision. So I've had to continually go, I don't have the answers, and that's okay. I'm not smart enough to have the answers. But actually we have extraordinary resource and mindset and collective intelligence across the fellowship. So let's see where that takes us.
You know, Rosie, it's interesting you say that. It's the first thing you've said in this interview. I thought, just if you were smart enough to have that, you'd cock it up, right? Because it's about the collective. You don't need to know.
Yeah.
You don't need to know. It's interesting. I'm listening to that and going, it's old thinking. It's old thinking. You know, I'm not smart enough to know. We've got to give up on that shit.
Yeah.
You know.
Well, that goes to the performance mindset.
So it goes to the performance mindset.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the performance mindset. We haven't finished with the fellowship, but let's talk about the performance mindset. Tell me about that.
I've been it's probably been through this process in the last year. And at the end of the day, taking the time to think about what triggered me, what caused me to go left or right, or to say that dumb thing, or to act in this way. And realising that what sat underneath most of it was a performance expectation that I was still carrying, often from years and years ago. And this is something that we've had it through school days. It comes up through our thinking about our choices, our career choices. In the corporate environment, it is always about the performance. And I've worked in environments where actually the quality of the leadership has been secondary to the delivery of the outputs. In other words, some people who are incredibly toxic within team environments being promoted because they got it done. And that performance culture has been, I think it is so toxic to us as individuals, but it's also toxic to us as a country, because it actually has prevented us, I believe, really collaborating, understanding how to work with each other, not to bring the expert mindset where we're only listening to fix, and we're only listening even to develop, and instead of coming with the listening to actually learn and not feeling that weight of having to provide the solutions, having to provide the answers, having to know, having to be the expert. And for anyone that's come from a consulting environment, you're sold because of your expertise. That commands your hourly rate. So letting go of that, letting go of having to know and faking it if you don't know, has been probably one of the most valuable things. and has allowed me to do this job without being overwhelmed. I think if you'd taken me back a few years, I would have worked myself into the ground, probably by this stage right now.
And Rosalie, it's interesting. That's, listening to that. There's some parallels with collective intelligence and the diversity thing, because it's really so liberating, because you can't know.
No,
It's just not possible.
there's just way too much ambiguity.
It's just not possible. And I've had conversations in the fellowship, and when we break into these little rooms on Zoom and break into 3 and 4 groups, like, I don't know what they're talking about. It's so liberating just to think, I don't have to know about this thing. So I think that's a really powerful side benefit of the diversity thing, is that you've got to let go of knowing shit and embrace, how do I actually serve this? What's my role?
Yeah.
Right? So what do you think your role is as CEO of the fellowship?
Oh, that's a very, very good question, and one that I'm working through for this next season. A big part of this year has been listening, has been hearing these different voices, understanding what their experience has been. For me, a lot of it has been being an advocate. I can see the runway, if I think of it as a metaphor, I can see the sort of runway for where we can and want to go. I think my role and the role of EHF is, how do we convene but powerfully convene? We're not going to architect what the fellows do, because they will do what they do.
They'll just do what they want to do.
They will do what they want to do, and there's a magic that occurs when there's collisions between them, when they find each other and they go, oh, you do this, and then we already see that there's an incredible magic that occurs at those points. So I think our power to convene, our power to translate, and I think that's a really interesting, because when you have very different cultures, very different mindsets, very different experiences that are coming together, words get used that have entirely different meanings. And sometimes, particularly sort of bringing them into New Zealand as well, part of what we need to do as translators is to create that space for them to listen and hear, because we don't want to do colonisation 2.0. We don't want to bring in white saviours. We don't want to bring in social justice warriors, who go, actually, I've got the answer for you. What we need is for people to come in and really listen and say, how do I support you? Because you know what the best way is forward. How do I help you?
And it's interesting, Rosalie, I've thought about this. In 2021, I think it was really good that our borders were closed for the fellowship, and that it's given the fellowship time to sort itself out before they start coming in, because, that is going to be a big deal when there's 240. That's just, it's not a lot of people, but when you know who it is, you just go, here we go.
Yeah.
And I think 2021 has been a blessing to actually slow that down, let you get settled in, and the fellowship to work out what it is and recalibrate and get itself settled in before you have all of this force coming into the country, and that you can actually make the most of that rather than waste it.
Yeah.
So I think that's one of the biggest benefits of COVID, is that delay, because it's interesting, and I've talked to a number of them. They're just itching to get here, and it makes you realise how their desire to get here is quite profound. Just going back to that performance stuff, or the destruction of performance, How do we stop that trend, Rosalie? Because there are so many arseholes that get to the top of organisations.
I've been reflecting on this because one of the things that I found perhaps most challenging is where you work in an organisation which is very much talking about not having a hero culture. We love hero cultures. You know, New Zealand, the culture of the hero, the culture of the saviour that comes in and fixes things is really strong.
We like that story.
We love that story. And so we've built entire organisations around doing just that.
Yep.
My concern is that we are beginning to talk about vulnerability. We're talking about, empowering leaders to make decisions at the coalface. Let's move away from hierarchical leadership. There's a lot of words that are being used, but my experience has been that unless there is something that has genuinely shifted within somebody, which is actually about letting go and being able to listen, it has to begin with the individual. I have worked in an environment where what was said above the line sounded absolutely amazing. Actually, it just sounded gorgeous. And then what actually happened below the line, and there was no security, and there was no psychological security. And that's what worries me, is that we're getting a generation that is learning the words, and that and with the best of intent, embracing it, but is still about hero leadership, performance leadership. My legacy is going to be based on what this organisation does, and I've only got 3 years to do it. And I don't know how we shift that, but we do have a younger generation. I'm not sure if you're going to get sort of certain generations that will be able to make that shift, but I'd like to feel that there's a younger generation that we could bring something different to.
Mm. One of the things that we have noticed with collective intelligence, the people we work with, Rosalie, is that the shinier the facade, the more insecurity there is below the surface. And I have I don't look for the facade, but every now and then you see this amazing facade, and you go, "Oh, wonder what's under there."
Yeah.
And it's and I often feel sorry for people who have built that thing, because they're terrified to take it down, and that facade can cause havoc.
Yeah.
Absolute unpredictable havoc, because there's just not enough personal base there to not look good, or to not be the man or the woman who knows the stuff. I talked to Sarah Tocker about this, one of our facilitators, a few months back, when she works a lot in central government, and they bring a new person in and they go, he's going to know the thing, he knows the thing. And we're just going, cool, he knows the thing, here comes the thing, he knows it.
Yeah.
It's all bullshit, right?
Yeah.
Nobody knows the thing.
Yeah.
And it's and Rosalie, okay, so what I'm going to say is, I think you're doing a fabulous job for the fellowship. Thank you. And I think you're doing a fabulous job because I don't think people are looking to you for the thing, that you are reaching out, and there is a team of people around you that seem to have a say, and it's not all about you.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Thank you. I hope that is the case. I really hope that is the case.
No, I think it's funny. I wasn't. Yeah, and I really mean that. I think it's not about you. It's about the fellowship, and it looks like you're creating this platform for us to do our thing somehow, and we've got to work that out for ourselves. And being entrepreneurs and oddbods and so forth is that you could have the most perfect situation for us, and we might just ignore it anyway and go, That looks a bit shiny. We'll go up to Tolliga Bay and do it there, right? So go and see Lily and do the thing, So that's how it works. Tell me what's exciting you. What excites you about our future here in Aotearoa?
When I left New Zealand, I didn't think that I was going to come back. I was like so many Kiwis in their OE. And while I was overseas, I began to really appreciate so much of what we had that I'd never even fully recognised. And I believe that as a small country, we have the power to do things differently. And my vision, if what I would love to see is that the world, we know the world does not have solutions for the challenges that we face. But New Zealand has the potential to work on things through and bring a completely different lens, to genuinely look at things through economic, social, and environmental well-being, and to be able to pilot and test things at a systems level that then could go to a global level. I genuinely believe we can do that. And partially it's because we are small. We are developed as a country. There are shared values, and we're not governed by fear as a country as I think some other countries are. We're not as fearful of each other. And so, to me, none of that is easy to have done. We do have a government that is actually accessible. So there is an opportunity to also work with government, to work with regulators, to do something different. It has been done with Space Agency here. There is power and opportunity to do that in other areas. I would love us to... We're not known in the world for our innovation. And what we have done is kind of, as Sir Paul Callaghan said, a bit weird and in the niche. But I think we have the potential to be known for values-based innovation. And I believe, and I hear this desire that we actually do so in a way that does embrace kaitiakitanga, manaakitanga, and that sort of intergenerational principle.
You know, when you hear something for the first time, and you might have heard it many times, but that's the first time I've heard values-based innovation. It's the first time that that's dropped into my consciousness. I like the sound of that.
It takes us away from the toxicity. And what's quite interesting in talking to a lot of the founders, and particularly a new generation of founders, they're not... Their ambition is purpose-led. It's about impact. It's actually not about making money. They may want to make enough money, but it's not, I'm going to grow big enough to sell and become a billionaire. That's not the driving piece for us, which is where I think that there is so much hope that we can have for a generation if we foster, if we take that forward. And it was one of the things that I really noticed with the fellowship, partially because of the people that have been selected, is that whereas in New Zealand we often talk about the mechanisms of innovation, we talk about R&D, research and development, we talk about the science, we talk about moving from start-up to scale-up. That language just really didn't appear with the fellows. It was all about impact. It was all about purpose and impact. So I feel that there is something really powerful that we can be. And while we can be small, we can be absolutely mighty. And we have already shown that on the global stage. You don't need to look at some of the global newspapers to see the way that we are watched, the way that we are
We forget that, eh?
We do forget that. There is something enormously appealing and attractive that we don't want to lose, that we can actually build on. And I don't want to be naive, but I actually think that we now have to we need to give ourselves the gritty optimism that gives us agency to move. And instead of the complacency that says, actually, we're okay, and walking slowly backwards from the change that's coming.
One of the proudest moments as a Kiwi was being in Paris one morning, coming down, picking up the paper on the foyer of a hotel, and there was a full page poster of Team New Zealand holding up the mug. And I can't remember who put it up there. It was one of the sponsors or something put up there. And I'm just looking at this and going, this is outrageous. Just this full page. Might have been the New York Times that had been shipped over to Paris. Might have been, can't remember. And I'm sitting there and a Frenchman comes past and I'm just looking at this. And he looks at me and goes, Kiwi? I mean, gave me the thumbs up. And I just thought, he knows about this. You know, he knows that this little country can build yachts that go faster than anybody else. And with sailors and, you know. And, yeah, it was like, yeah, look at us. It felt really, I don't know, it was quite surreal to experience that over the other side, because the day before we just won the America's Cup. Rosalie, what's your biggest hope for the year ahead, 2022? What's your biggest hope for the year? In anything?
Oh. At a national level, I think we should be incredibly proud of what we have achieved through COVID. My hope would be that we do not begin to fragment. We do not begin to dig and tear each other apart, but instead we begin to come together and look at how do we use this opportunity to actually, I don't want to use this sort of slogan of build back better, but we don't want to just rebuild what was in the past. We can actually build, we can empower our startup ecosystem to really become an economic engine. We can help those incredible small businesses that have maybe now got fresh leadership that want to do something really different. How do we help them to really sort of step out? So I would love to see us move beyond the mindset of protectionism and start to move towards what can we achieve, but also still being conscious of our care for each other. For EHF, I really do want to welcome those fellows into the country. My goal is that we have such clarity and focus, even though we know what we need to do in the next 2 years, how we welcome, how we connect, introduce into industry, all of those pieces, that we're running the pilots that can do the extraordinary beyond 2 years. We're running those pilots that allow us to do a completely new business model for the future. And for me, that has implications. We've got to think about how do we build the team? How do we access the resources? What does that look like? But actually, a lot of that just flows on from having that absolute clarity. This is what we can do, and this is how we can get there.
Good luck.
Thank you.
Rosalie, before we wind up, is there a topic that we haven't covered or something that you want to drop into this conversation? I've got one more question.
Harv, I love your questions. So rather than me rabbiting on, much prefer to
Tell
hear.
me about George.
Oh, my gorgeous daughter. She and I are closest of friends. She is my joy, she is my delight. I have to say, and this is maybe sort of somewhat controversial, but when I found myself pregnant in London, no family, relationship that was clearly not stable, there were many who said to me, "Are you sure that you want to go ahead with this? Are you sure you want to go through with this?" And there were times that I thought about all my options, and that was the full spectrum, including adoption, including, could I do this? Could I do this? And the piece for me that while it was actually bloody hard, she is such a joy, 24, living in Melbourne, so many friends, courageous, so courageous, loves people, values people, has such a generosity of spirit. She's just finished her university degree, but actually she's really loving working in hospitality and has been managing a French wine bar, and now she's been moved into managing a cafe, a French cafe with 16 staff under her. And she loves the working of teams and building teams. So calls me most days just to have a chat, just to get advice.
Nice.
So she's a real joy to me.
You two have been through a lot together. Yeah, sounds like you made the right decision, Rosalie. Yeah?
Without any question. And that issue of performance mindset, that's my only one thing, is that it often meant I couldn't be as present as I wanted to be. That's my regret. That's my biggest regret. That the need to be, to do, to deliver, took up weekends, took up evenings, took up so much. So that's something that I'd redo again. But then if I say that to Georgia, she said, "Mum, I feel no lack. I have never felt any lack." So hopefully.
Yeah, I was going to say that's all about you. That's not about George.
Yeah.
A bit of guilt there or whatever, but
a bit of guilt.
It's interesting because there are, lots of very hard-working parents out there whose kids are just fine. It's and you have parents who spend an enormous amount of time with their kids, and it doesn't always give a great outcome. Yeah. Rosalie, thank you for this time. And so the question is there anything that popped into your head while we were... No?
The one final piece that I want to say is that when I first met you, Harv, and you started talking about collective intelligence, even though I didn't fully understand it, there was something that really excited me. So I just want to thank you for what you're doing, for the journey that you are taking people on, because I think that there is a power in this that is about the leadership for the future, and I would love to understand more.
And this year, Rosalie, we have got our messaging clearer, and hopefully you'll be able to understand it more. And I am really excited about 2022. I've never been more excited about in my professional career ever than I am right now. And it's because after 14 years of collective intelligence, we're starting to understand what we do. And I'm not going to be embarrassed by that, but when you're doing something that's different and new and hasn't been done before, and diversity is such a complex beast, but I'm hoping that you'll understand it this year as this new messaging comes. Yeah, we love our work. And I'm also really interested to see the interplay between collective intelligence and the fellowship, and we're starting to see that now. And we've got half a dozen fellows now become members of collective intelligence, and seeing the alignment of the values and being able to integrate them into New Zealand and all that sort of stuff. Yeah, it's going to be really interesting going forward. Really interesting. Yeah. Rosalie, good luck for 2022. Keep up the good work of not knowing shit. It's overrated. And it's going to be interesting to see as these fellows come into the country bit by bit. 50, I think, in the first tranche, isn't it? And then, and then, from there.
In total, there's probably about 270.
Yeah.
In the next 15 months, if the borders open and Omicron doesn't throw us.
All that stuff.
Yeah.
And it's for people listening, 270 doesn't sound many, and I'm going, wow, that will be. That's a wow to me. Rosalie, happy 2022 and keep up the good work.
Ngā mihi nui, thank you.
You've just been listening to an episode of Stuff That Matters Now, brought to you by Collective Intelligence. I hope you enjoyed listening to the fun stuff, the rugged stuff and the complete stuff-ups that have helped this particular Collective Intelligence member evolve while making the world a better place. Do check out our Stuff That Matters Now podcast series on your favourite podcast provider, or visit our website www.collectiveintelligence.co.nz to get links to new episodes. Contact us if you want to learn more about how we can help you evolve yourself and others. Thanks for listening.